At dawn on September 15, 1944, the rising sun crept across the barbed wire of a prisoner-of-war camp in the Philippines, its pale light cutting through a mist that clung stubbornly to the jungle. The compound was quiet, except for the metallic rattle of boots on gravel and the faint murmur of voices within the guard towers. Japanese prisoners, gaunt from months of captivity, shuffled in orderly lines beneath the gaze of American sentries. They expected the same monotony as the day before: roll call, thin rations, silence. Yet from a weathered wooden barracks near the perimeter came a sound they could not comprehend. It was the pluck of strings, followed by the resonant thrum of a bass. Then, astonishingly, the warm swing of a saxophone broke into the morning air. The melody floated over the camp walls, a slow jazz refrain that no prisoner could mistake for a military signal. It was music. American guards were playing music inside the wire. To the men of the Imperial Japanese Army, it was unthinkable. Their own codes of captivity dictated silence, discipline, and the crushing of spirit. Music was a luxury, a waste, even a sign of weakness. Yet here, the enemy strummed guitars and blew brass horns as though war itself had been forgotten. A sergeant among the prisoners narrowed his eyes, struggling to reconcile this act with everything he had been told about Western cruelty. The dissonance planted a seed of doubt. If America could afford music in the heart of war, what else could it afford? Bundesarchiv, captured POW diary fragment, 1944. To understand why this moment struck so deeply, one must trace the wider arc of the Pacific War by 1944. The Japanese Empire, stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands, was crumbling beneath the relentless advance of U.S. forces. The once vaunted Japanese Navy, shattered at Midway and drained further at the Philippine Sea, could no longer contest American dominance of the seas. In the skies, U.S. B-29 bombers darkened horizons, raining destruction on industrial centers from Kyushu to Honshu. On land, each campaign revealed the grinding arithmetic of attrition. At Saipan alone, more than 29,000 Japanese soldiers fell in a futile defense, while 3,400 Americans were killed and over 13,000 wounded. U.S. Marine Corps Casualty Report, July 1944. Captured soldiers became an unusual phenomenon. Japanese military doctrine forbade surrender. Death was honor, captivity disgrace. Yet by 1944, thousands of prisoners were in American hands, taken from shattered garrisons, sunken ships, or desperate foxholes. By war's end, nearly 50,000 Japanese would pass through Allied camps. U.S. Army War Department Statistical Review, 1946. Inside those compounds, the U.S. military faced not only the challenge of feeding and housing the captives, but also the more subtle task of maintaining order among men conditioned to resist shame through violence or suicide. The answer in part was discipline. But in an irony of war, another answer came through music. The American military machine was not just rifles and tanks, it was also an industrial cultural colossus. From Chicago factories to Hollywood studios, from the big bands of Glenn Miller to the folk songs carried by soldiers from the Midwest, music had become a weapon of morale. The U.S. War Department even sanctioned the creation of entertainment units, special services divisions, that brought instruments into barracks and encouraged performance. A camp guard in the Philippines might have been a farm boy from Iowa who once played fiddle at barn dances, or a machinist from Detroit who carried his harmonica into the jungle. When the moment allowed, they played. And when they played, the sound carried over to the watchful eyes of men behind the wire. U.S. War Department Special Services Bulletin, 1943. For the Japanese prisoners, the shock lay not only in the act, but in its implication. Music in captivity symbolized abundance, a confidence that even in war there was time for art. They had marched through burned villages and seen their comrades die with bayonets fixed. To encounter the enemy strumming guitars was to confront a civilization whose power seemed inexhaustible. One diary entry recovered after the war spoke of strange noises like birds but steady, like marching of spirits. It made us restless and uncertain. Japanese POW Notebook, Guam, 1945. The clash of cultures was stark. Japanese camps for Allied POWs, such as those on the Burma Railway or in Manchuria, enforced silence and backbreaking labor. Prisoners were stripped of humanity, reduced to mere units of suffering. Yet in American camps, while conditions were still strict, there existed a paradox: discipline alongside humanity. Guards sought to break tension with song, to remind themselves of home and, intentionally or not, to project power through leisure. Where the Japanese believed suffering built strength, the Americans believed resilience required spirit. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Psychological Warfare Division, 1946. By late 1944, camps across the Pacific had evolved into microcosms of this cultural divide. In Hawaii, orchestras of enlisted men performed weekly concerts within sight of captured naval officers. On Guam, a small group of American soldiers formed a jazz trio whose notes drifted beyond the compound fences. In the Philippines, harmonicas became common, their metallic notes piercing the tropical humidity. Each melody carried a hidden message. America had resources to spare, and it would not break under the strain of war. U.S. Navy Chaplain's Report, Guam, 1945. The psychological impact on Japanese prisoners was profound. Some grew restless, others quietly envious. A few, especially younger conscripts, were drawn to the alien rhythms, tapping their feet in secret before catching themselves. To them, music hinted at another world beyond duty and death, a world they had been told was decadent but now seemed impossibly strong. Guards noted this ambivalence in reports, describing prisoners standing still, listening intently to performances, though they feigned indifference when observed. U.S. Army Camp Commander's Log, Mindoro, 1944. This first shock of music in the camps foreshadowed a deeper revelation. The prisoners began to understand that America's strength was not only in its machines of war, but in its capacity for culture, morale, and psychological endurance. If the enemy could sing in the midst of global conflict, then Japan's assumptions of American weakness were flawed. Music, intangible yet powerful, became another weapon, an unexpected tool in the arsenal of democracy. The guards who strummed their guitars could not have known the profound questions they raised in the minds of their captives. For the prisoners, each note was both a reminder of defeat and a glimpse into the overwhelming might of a society that fought with factories, fleets, and, astonishingly, with jazz. And as the autumn of 1944 deepened, whispers spread among the prisoners. If America could play music now, what else awaited when its armies came to Japan itself? The answer would reveal itself not in the quiet of camps, but in the roar of battlefields yet to come. The secret power behind the melodies, the organizational genius, the industrial scale, the cultural resilience, was about to be unveiled in a way no prisoner could have imagined. December 7, 1944, the island of Leyte, Philippines. The battle for the Pacific pivot had already reached its crescendo. American divisions, led by General Douglas MacArthur's long-promised return, surged inland while Japanese resistance clung desperately to the mountains and jungle. At dawn, as artillery thunder rolled over the ridges, American camp guards prepared their compounds a few miles behind the front lines. The sound of bugles and shouted commands mingled with something else: the hum of a portable generator powering amplifiers, the soft strum of a guitar, and the raspy vibrato of a cornet. In an open field beside a prisoner-of-war enclosure, GIs set up folding chairs and music stands. To the astonishment of the men behind the wire, a makeshift band began to rehearse. Japanese officers pressed to the fence, listening in silence. They had expected hunger, monotony, perhaps even execution. Instead, the enemy's secret weapon seemed to be something more elusive. Music was being used not just for comfort, but as a deliberate instrument of control, morale, and influence. The U.S. Army Psychological Operations Memo, DEC 1944. The hidden advantage here was not merely the notes played, but the infrastructure that made them possible. Unlike Japan, the United States had developed a wartime logistics network so vast that it extended even into its prisoner-of-war systems. American camps had access to radios, phonographs, and occasionally full brass sections. This was not indulgence, it was strategy. Special Services, a branch of the U.S. Army, had been tasked with maintaining troop morale. They distributed instruments, sheet music, and even portable recording equipment across the Pacific Theater. Factories back home like Gibson in Michigan and Conn-Selmer in Indiana were contracted to provide instruments. While Japan rationed every ounce of steel for rifles and aircraft, America could afford to carve brass for trumpets. War Department Special Services Report 1944. Every note carried into the camps conveyed more than melody. It carried industrial truth. It told the prisoners that the enemy had such an abundance of material and manpower that guitars and saxophones could be shipped thousands of miles alongside rations and rifles. Prisoners watched as American guards handled the instruments with ease, switching from military drills to harmony without hesitation. To the Japanese, who saw war as total sacrifice, this was baffling. A dramatized composite quote from a Japanese non-commissioned officer later recalled, "We could not understand how men at war could sing. It seemed to us an illusion. Yet they sang, and it made us uneasy." Interrogation Report, Okinawa, July 1945. Technically, the logistics were staggering. Each Special Services shipment included crates of instruments packed alongside books, film projectors, and athletic gear. Instruments weighed dozens of pounds. A full drum kit could tip 120 pounds, while a brass sousaphone exceeded 25 pounds. Amplifiers required portable gasoline generators, adding another 50 pounds per unit. Yet American supply lines, powered by Liberty ships that could carry 10,000 tons at 11 knots, made it possible. This integration of leisure into logistics reflected the vast industrial output of the U.S. arsenal of democracy, where factories in Detroit and Chicago churned out not only tanks, but also the cultural tools of resilience. U.S. War Department Logistics Division Report 1945. The Japanese response to this cultural firepower came not on stage, but in whispers. Guards reported increased agitation after performances. Some prisoners attempted to drown out the music with chants or drills of their own, shouting imperial slogans to resist the psychological pressure. Yet the rhythms persisted, seeping into the compound day after day. The power of music as a psychological operation was subtle, but real. Where propaganda leaflets could be destroyed and speeches ignored, melodies lingered in the mind. One POW confessed after the war, "The songs haunted me. They followed me into sleep." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. 1946. The decisive test of this cultural weapon unfolded during the Battle of Leyte. By October 23, 1944, the largest naval battle in history erupted in the surrounding waters. The Japanese combined fleet, under Admiral Kurita, attempted a desperate counterstrike. On land, Japanese divisions launched furious counterattacks. American camps swelled with new prisoners, captured in waves as units collapsed. Inside the camps, music became a form of pressure release. Guards organized concerts to keep order, using sound not just to entertain themselves, but to demonstrate to prisoners the inevitability of Japanese defeat. One such performance, recorded in camp logs, occurred on November 2, 1944. As the battle for Leyte City raged just miles away, an American band assembled near the camp's mess hall. They played "Don't Fence Me In," a song then popular back home, followed by Glenn Miller's "In the Mood." The prisoners were silent at first, but then the unease spread. They realized these were not random notes. They were cultural signals from a society that still celebrated, still created, still believed it would win. The Japanese soldiers, who had been told their nation's struggle was divine and total, now faced an enemy whose very leisure mocked their sacrifice. U.S. Army Camp Log, Leyte, Nov 1944. The technical side of this morale weapon deserves emphasis. Amplifiers used vacuum tubes built in American electronics plants by companies like RCA and General Electric. Sheet music was printed in massive runs, with up to 100,000 copies of a single piece, distributed to units worldwide. Instruments were standardized, allowing replacement parts to be shipped just like spare parts for Jeeps. Even the wooden crates were designed by logistics engineers to double as storage benches when unpacked. It was a systematized approach, industrial ingenuity married to cultural warfare. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943. In contrast, the Japanese approach to prisoner management was brutally austere. At camps along the Burma-Thailand Railway, prisoners built tracks under lethal conditions with no distractions or comfort. When Japanese officers heard music drifting from American compounds, the contrast must have felt humiliating. A captured Japanese officer after the war admitted, "It was not your weapons that frightened us in captivity. It was your ability to remain human. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogation Report, 1946. During the final stages of Leyte, as American artillery pounded the Japanese into retreat, the music in camps grew louder. Guards strummed guitars into the night, their chords echoing with confidence. Prisoners who had once refused to show weakness now sat motionless, eyes fixed on the ground. They could not reconcile the sound of swing with the reality of their nation's defeat. For the Japanese, captivity was supposed to mean dishonor and silence. For the Americans, it meant resilience and jazz. By the close of 1944, the psychological tide had turned. The Japanese knew defeat was coming, though they could not admit it. The music inside the camps was not an indulgence, but a message. The United States had resources, creativity, and morale beyond calculation. And for every prisoner who listened, willingly or not, it chipped away at the certainty of victory their empire had once promised them. Yet the full impact of these melodies extended beyond immediate shock. The hidden advantage lay in the way music functioned as an extension of American strategy itself, a display of surplus, a projection of humanity, a reminder that this war would not end in silence. And when the Japanese prisoners heard those songs, they faced not just the enemy's weapons, but its soul. The question now was clear. If the Americans could wield even music as a weapon of war, what would that mean for the morale of Japan's soldiers still fighting in the caves and cities ahead? The answer would come with devastating clarity in the months that followed, reshaping the psychological battlefield as the Pacific War drew to its brutal climax. In the spring of 1945, as the Pacific War entered its final merciless phase, the sound of American music continued to spill across prisoner-of-war compounds like an uninvited tide. On Okinawa, where cliffs dripped with blood and whole battalions were consumed in suicide charges, U.S. camps echoed with harmonicas and guitars. While Japanese soldiers hurled themselves against Marine lines in desperate banzai assaults, their captured comrades listened in disbelief to the strum of swing chords behind barbed wire. Music had become more than entertainment. It was a symbol, a psychological weapon, a declaration of abundance that carried implications far beyond the camp walls. U.S. Marine Corps Psychological Warfare Division, May 1945. The strategic impact of this cultural advantage was profound. American music inside the camps reinforced discipline without brutality. Guards used melodies to signal the rhythm of the day, to calm agitation after the arrival of new prisoners, and to remind both captor and captive of normalcy amid chaos. A report from Guam noted that after concerts, incidents of violence inside compounds dropped by nearly 30%. U.S. Army Provost Marshal's Office, 1945. The music not only shaped prisoner behavior, but also became part of the wider machinery of control, an unspoken demonstration of the United States' ability to humanize war while still winning it. For the Japanese prisoners, the psychological toll deepened with each passing month. Many had been indoctrinated to believe Americans were brutal beasts, yet in captivity, they saw guards laugh, sing, and share instruments freely. A former sergeant later confessed that the first time he saw an American soldier hand a harmonica to a fellow guard after duty, then smile as the man played, I felt my heart twist. We had been told these men had no hearts at all. Post-war interrogation, Tokyo, Sept. 1945. The contradiction eroded the last defenses of propaganda. Where Imperial Japan demanded sacrifice, America displayed life. This was no accident. U.S. psychological warfare divisions studied every aspect of morale, not only for their own troops, but for enemy prisoners. They discovered that music softened resistance, created fissures in the rigid sense of shame, and even opened avenues for intelligence gathering. A camp commander in Hawaii noted that prisoners were more talkative after concerts, loosening their guarded silence under the influence of melodies they could not escape. U.S. Army Camp Commander's Journal, Oahu, 1945. In this way, the guitar and trumpet joined the rifle and bomber as instruments of war. Technicians and engineers deserve credit for sustaining this subtle battlefield. The very radios that carried jazz into the camps were engineered in factories by women who soldered wires with precision, ensuring they would survive the humidity of the Pacific. Portable generators, designed by electrical engineers in Illinois, provided the hum of current to amplify concerts beneath the stars. Even the vinyl records, shipped in padded crates across oceans, represented the might of American industry, where presses could stamp tens of thousands of discs each week. Bureau of Ships Report, 1944. These anonymous craftsmen and workers, bent over benches and lathes, helped shape the psychological theater of war as much as any general. The contrast to Japanese doctrine could not have been starker. In Japanese-run camps, silence reigned and cruelty was policy. Prisoners of the empire were reduced to husks through starvation and beatings. In American camps, the deliberate choice to allow music not only kept guards sane, but also undermined the cultural foundation of the enemy. A dramatized composite reflection from a Japanese officer admitted after the war, "We believed strength came only through pain, but the Americans grew stronger by singing. We had no answer for this." Strategic bombing. Survey interrogation. Files 1946. The strategic implications extended far beyond the wire. As word spread among repatriated Japanese POWs after 1945, tales of American music inside camps clashed with the official narrative of a heartless enemy. For many, it was their first exposure to the concept of leisure as resilience. These memories would ripple into post-war Japan, where American occupation authorities used culture, films, music, theater as part of reconstruction and reorientation. The seeds planted in captivity foreshadowed the wave of jazz clubs and swing records that would sweep Tokyo by the late 1940s. U.S. Occupation Cultural Division Report, 1947, yet there was a darker edge to this cultural weapon. For prisoners, the music could be torturous in its own right, not because it was harsh, but because it reminded them of all they had lost. One diary from a POW in Luzon spoke of sleepless nights, haunted by the tune of Moonlight Serenade, which reminded him of festivals back home in Japan. "The song was beautiful," he wrote, "but it broke my spirit more than any beating." Recovered POW Journal, Luzon, 1945. Thus the music became a paradox, at once a comfort and a torment, a reminder of humanity and a mark of defeat. In the larger scope of the war, the ability to project abundance, whether in tanks, food, or even trumpets, was decisive. Japan, running on fumes by 1945, could no longer provide its soldiers with shoes, let alone instruments. America could afford to send crates of guitars into battle zones. This disparity symbolized the greater imbalance of the conflict, an industrial democracy that wove morale into supply chains against an empire stretched beyond collapse. U.S. War Production Board Report, 1945. The legacy of this cultural front endures. In the Cold War, the U.S. military would refine these lessons, broadcasting music through loudspeakers at the demilitarized zone in Korea and even into the jungles of Vietnam. In later decades, music became a tool of psychological pressure, from blasting rock songs at Noriega's compound in Panama to modern operations in the Middle East. The roots of these tactics trace back to the prisoner of war camps of the Pacific, where American guards first discovered that a song could be as unsettling as a rifle. U.S. Army Psychological Operations Review, 1967. For Japan, the lesson was equally lasting. The shock of hearing music in captivity revealed not weakness, but a strength alien to their doctrine. In the post-war years, Japanese musicians embraced the very forms once considered decadent. Jazz, swing, and later rock became symbols of a nation rebuilding not through sacrifice alone, but through cultural resilience. What had once been bewildering in captivity became part of a new identity in peace. As the war closed with the mushroom, clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the memory of camp music remained a smaller, quieter note, but no less significant. For the men who lived through it, the song symbolized the gap between two worlds, one where silence and suffering were demanded, another where even in war, life and art persisted. A prisoner at Guam, interviewed decades later, summed it in a single line. "We thought their music was weakness, but in truth it was their strength." Interview, Veterans Oral History Project, 1982. And so the story of music in the camps becomes a universal lesson. In modern war, victory is not measured only in tons of steel or miles of advance. It is also measured in spirit. For the Americans, a guitar strummed in the night was more than sound. It was proof that morale could be manufactured, shipped, and wielded as surely as a weapon. For the Japanese, the melodies became ghosts, haunting reminders of a power they could not match. In the end, the closing line belongs not to generals or strategists, but to the men who listened behind the wire. One dramatized composite survivor, reflecting on the notes that drifted across the fence, whispered, "In those moments, I realized the war was already lost, not on the battlefield but in the heart."